All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most famous and, let's be honest, one of the most unsettling experiments in the history of psychology. We're talking about Stanley Milgram's infamous 1963 study on obedience to authority. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Would you deliver a fatal electric shock to a total stranger? Now, your gut reaction is probably, of course not. No way, right? But is it really that simple? Okay, but let's add a little wrinkle here. What if a scientist, at a fancy university, wearing a lab coat and looking all official, what if he calmly tells you that you have to continue? Does that change anything? Well, that's the exact question Stanley Milgram was trying to answer. Well, get ready for this, because the results were absolutely staggering. In his main study, a full 65% of regular people just like you and me, were willing to administer the maximum shock. We're talking 450 volts, marked as potentially fatal. So the real question isn't if people would obey, it's why. No, Milgram didn't think these people were evil or monsters, not at all. He believed something else was going on. He proposed that there's this kind of psychological switch inside all of us, and it just flips when we're confronted by someone we see as a legitimate authority figure. So to explain this, Milgram said we basically operate in two different modes. The first is what he called the autonomous state. That's our normal mode, right? We act based on our own conscience, and we feel responsible for what we do. But when we're in the presence of an authority figure, we can slip into this other mode he called the agentic state. And that move from one state to the other, Milgram called it the agentic shift. It's that key moment where you stop seeing yourself as the one in charge. Instead, you start to see yourself as just an instrument, an agent carrying out someone else's orders. You're basically passing the responsibility up the chain. But here's the thing, this shift isn't easy. It's not like you just flip a switch and feel fine. When an order goes against your own moral code, you feel what Milgram called moral strain. And this is a huge deal. It's that deep, gut-wrenching anxiety people felt. They weren't just happily pressing buttons. They were sweating, they were shaking, they were arguing, but they kept on obeying. So how on earth did Milgram cook up a situation powerful enough to make people do this? Let's pull back the curtain and look at the actual setup of this pretty ingenious and honestly pretty deceptive experiment. Okay, so the scene is set at the prestigious Yale University. Milgram gets 40 regular guys to volunteer for what he tells them is a study about memory. Big deception right there. Then there's this rigged draw for roles. The real participant, they always get the role of teacher. And the other guy, who's actually an actor, he always becomes the learner. This learner is then led into another room and strapped into a chair with electrodes on his wrists. So now the teacher is sitting in front of this terrifying-looking shock machine. It's got 30 switches going from a tiny 15 volts all the way up to a massive 450. The instructions are simple. For every wrong answer the learner gives, you flip a switch and deliver a shock. And with each mistake, you have to go up to the next level. Now, of course, the shocks weren't real, but the screams of pain, they were pre-recorded and sounded horribly real, getting worse and worse until just silence. Now, what happens if the teacher starts to hesitate? Well, the experimenter in the lab coat had a script. He'd give a series of 4 standardized prods. It would start gently, something like, please continue, but if the teacher kept protesting, the pressure would build, all the way up to the 4th and final command, which was this absolute showstopper. You have no other choice, you must go on. And unbelievably, it worked. That 65% we talked about, that translates to 26 out of the 40 men who went all the way to the final 450-volt switch. They kept going, even after the screams had stopped, and the learner had gone completely silent. But Milgram's work didn't end there. See, he was just as interested in what makes people disobey. So he decided to flip the script. He ran a whole bunch of variations on the experiment, and what he discovered is just how much the situation matters and how fragile our obedience can actually be. It turns out the power of the situation was everything. For example, when he moved the experiment away from prestigious Yale to just some rundown office building, obedience dropped to about 48%. And get this, when the experimenter took off his lab coat, just that simple symbol of authority, the rate of obedience absolutely plummeted to 20%. And how close you were to the person you were hurting, that was huge. In a version where the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand down onto a shock plate, can you imagine that? obedience dropped way down to 30%. The moment it stopped being an abstract button-pushing exercise and became real and personal, it got a whole lot harder to obey. So as you can imagine, for all its mind-blowing insights, Milgram's work is, well, it's hugely controversial. It left behind this really complicated legacy that honestly, psychologists are still arguing about today. So, what are we to make of this? Is it a flawed masterpiece? I think that's a good way to put it. Because on one hand, the experiment was designed in a way that gave its findings real weight. But on the other hand, oh boy, it was just riddled with some major ethical problems and limitations that make you question the whole thing. So let's start with the good stuff. A huge strength was how controlled it was, because everything was standardized, the experimenter's script, the screams, the whole setup. It meant every single participant went through the exact same experience. And that's super important in science, because it means other researchers can replicate the study to see if they get the same results. Okay, but the limitations, they're pretty severe. First, the ethics. I mean, this is the big one. Participants were lied to, and they were put under incredible stress. They walked out of there thinking they might have actually killed someone. Second, critics point out that it lacks what they call ecological validity. Basically, how much does zapping someone in a lab really tell us about obedience in the real world? It's a pretty artificial situation. And finally, the sample group was just 40 men from one area in the US. How could we say this applies to everyone, to women, to people in other cultures? So, what's the big takeaway here? What does this 60-year-old experiment really tell us about ourselves today? Well, it's important to know that Milgram, who was Jewish, started this research to try and understand the Holocaust. He wondered, were the people who did those things just different? Were they all monsters? His results pointed to a chillingly different answer: no. His work suggested that it's often the situation, not the person, that drives behavior. It's a terrifying thought that maybe anyone, under the right or wrong set of circumstances, could be capable of doing terrible things. And that brings us right back to where we started. Back to you. It's so easy to sit here and think, oh, I'd be the one to say no. I would have walked out. But Milgram's legacy is that it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. When the pressure is on, when you feel that shift happening, how sure are you really?